You're listening to the Raising Family Podcast with your hosts, David Steele and Linda Hill. Brought to you by thefamilyproclamation.org.
Hello, and welcome to the Raising Family Podcast. I'm your host, David Steele, along with co-host Linda Hill. And today we're talking about paragraph 5 of the Family Proclamation, and we are blessed to have with us LeAnn Jackson. And she is the director of nursing at a senior living center here in Utah County, and also spent a lot of time as a hospice nurse, over 25 years, I think, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a while. And we're talking about paragraph 5. Maybe I'll just read the paragraph so we know kind of what we're talking about. We're sort of talking about the sanctity of life. And so I'll just read that. So it's, we declare the means by which mortal life is created to be divinely appointed. We affirm the sanctity of life and of its importance in God's eternal plan. And so I guess before we jump into some questions, today we're going to kind of be talking a little bit about kind of the affirmation of life in kind of the later section of life. I know that this paragraph kind of leads a lot of the times just straight to like abortion and that kind of sanctity of life. And we kind of want to focus a little bit more on later in life. Towards the end of life. So, LeAnn, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself,
Okay.
About your family, about your work, and then we can just jump into some questions.
Sure. I became a nurse in 1991. I became a RN, and I worked at the developmental center in American Fork for several years. And then my dad was in a really tragic accident and was killed.
Oh.
And I had a very dear friend that worked with me, and he came to me one day and he said that he'd had a dream that he didn't see. He said, "You can't work here anymore." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I've had a dream, and I saw you going into the homes of people, and I had these words, and I wrote down these words. I dreamed it 3 nights. I wrote down these words." And he read me the words, and they were word for word my patriarchal blessing.
Whoa.
And
wow.
he'd never seen my patriarchal blessing because I don't
goodness.
share my patriarchal blessing. Anyway, there is a section in my patriarchal blessing that says you will go into the homes of those who are sick or otherwise afflicted, and your presence alone will bring them comfort. So
wow.
It's pretty specific.
Yeah, it was really specific. I thought, oh no, I'm going to be your Relief Society president. Help me. But anyway, he said to me at that time, I have a really good friend who's a hospice nurse. I want you to go with her. I'm going to arrange that. And I'm like, wait a minute. I'd worked for the state for a long time. So I was vested in the state. And when I agreed. So I went with his friend on a Saturday, and I quit my job that I'd had for years on Monday and became a hospice nurse.
Wow.
And, but my dad actually, I've been really blessed in my life to be able to tell when there are spirits in a room that I can't see, but I can feel. And so I got confirmation from my father, my dad, and from my Heavenly Father that was the thing I was supposed to do. And my husband was so great. We decided that's what I would do. And I became a hospice nurse. So I was a hospice nurse for almost 25 years. And it was my passion. I loved it so much. It is hard to explain to people the difference in living and dying and the sanctity of life. I mean, there's a lot of things that we have real problems letting go of people. So
I think it must be, that must just be an amazing thing. I personally have never been at the bedside of someone as they've passed. I have known, I've had many friends and other family members that have had that experience. And I've heard that it is just one of the most sacred, amazing experiences to be.
It is the most sacred thing.
And so
I think
that really must be a calling. It really must be an absolute calling.
I'm
how
sure
specific
that it is.
Well,
I feel bad because I backed out of my calling for a while. I said, I need to be released. It is, things changed in the hospice arena as far as for nurses because the paperwork aspect of hospice became absolutely ridiculous, and it's very hard to constantly have to justify why you've left somebody on hospice for so long. So,
oh my goodness.
But,
Well, so in all of that, here we're talking about this paragraph 5. What do you think that the phrase divinely appointed means?
I just really feel like when you're divinely appointed, it means that Heavenly Father is the one in charge. He's the one who's made these decisions. And I really felt like for years that I'd been divinely appointed to be a hospice nurse. And I know that probably bothers people, and they just like, it's just your job, but it wasn't just my job. I mean, I don't know. It's just been something that I feel that I was divinely appointed to do. And I feel like there's sanctity in birth, there's sanctity in marriage, there's sanctity in life, there's sanctity in death. And I just feel like hospice was such a wonderful blessing to a lot of people. So it's hard. Sometimes I've had people who did not believe what I believed, that wanted, that as their loved one died, they'd say, "Oh my gosh, LeAnn, I just want to believe what you believe." I'm like, it's really easy. Here's this little blue book.
Wow.
So,
well, so with all of the amazing heroic measures that we have medically these days, to prolong life. I mean, we do. I know that there's a lot of different theories and ideas about how long should we make someone suffer, or how long. I mean, I guess what are some of your thoughts on this? Because there's some people that feel like that's very cruel to let someone die naturally if there's something that could be done to prolong them, even for weeks or months or years at incredible expense to a family. And do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes,
there's
I absolutely
a lot
know
of
what you're
arguments there,
about.
right? And then, of course, there's that other extreme of the whole Dr. Kevorkian, something's coming, let's just cut it off so there's no suffering. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are. I mean, in what you've dealt with.
Well, I think there's a difference between passive euthanasia and active euthanasia. I've had people beg me to give them a lethal dose of something, because they were so deep into pain and stuff. And I mean, I'm bound to not be able to do that, but as a nurse, I can't do that. And I never did do that. But I also, and I explained this earlier, I had a really hard time when we have a 90-year-old person who's lived this wonderful life and they're not able to swallow anymore. So the family takes them to the hospital and puts a feeding tube in. And then they come to me and say, we really want to put her on hospice, but you've got to keep feeding her. And it's like, we can't do that. If death is a really natural progression for most people. I mean, yeah, there's some really horrible things that people die of. I've seen some really horrible deaths. But I've also been accused before of playing God by asking someone to remove a feeding tube. But I wondered who played God and put the feeding tube in. Because that person was no longer able to swallow on their own. And I'm not talking about somebody who's had horrible, trauma to their throat, or, something like this, or stomach cancer, and they can no longer eat and they can't hold anything down. But I'm just talking about extending someone's life because we don't want you to die. That's really hard for me. But your body knows when it's not hungry, when you're not able to swallow, when you're not able to eat anymore. And so you go to sleep, and that's been the most precious thing, to watch someone just drift away. But that's really hard for a lot of people. I mean, it's hard for people even who work in assisted living. We know what's going to happen. We know that a lot of times is kind of considered heaven's waiting room.
Right.
And it's really hard for people to finally decide that they're going to put their loved one on hospice and then let them go naturally, and naturally is so sweet.
Yeah,
I see people. Go ahead.
I just think when you said that earlier too, about them kind of drifting away is kind of precious.
It's precious.
Maybe just say a couple more things about how maybe what you've felt or what you've learned or what you've seen during some of those moments of kind of the beauty of of life, kind of passing on to a different kind of life.
Right.
Kind
I
of,
hope I can do that without crying, because to me, it's so emotional. I've done it for 25 years. You'd think I'd quit crying, but I don't. But anyway, I've seen people many times call out for a person who's passed, or during their decline have said to me, "Can't you see that little boy sitting on the couch?" And you can't say, well, you can't say, "Oh, there's not a little boy sitting on that couch. What are you talking about?" Their reality is their reality. So if I had a patient who said that, I would always say, "Just tell me about him. Who does he look like?" And they'd say, "Well, can't you see him?" And it's like, well, I'm not really sure that I'm seeing the same thing you are. I would never say, because you have families that come in and say, "Mother, I've told you over and over, there is nobody in this room." It's like, it's so hard for me to hear that. It's so hard for me to hear somebody say, "I've told you that over and over. Why can't you remember?" Because they can't. Because they may have dementia. They may have, there's things. I hope nobody holds me, responsible for everything I ever can't remember, because boy, would we be in trouble. But, so I've sat at the bedside of people who, I had a sweet patient that had been a primary chorister for years and years. And so she and I would sing primary songs, and I would lay in her bed with her and we'd just sing primary songs. And it was so precious.
Sweet.
But one day she looked up and she sat straight up in bed. She looked at her door and she said, "Why?" And she said this man's name, "Where have you been?"
Oh.
And I just looked at her and she said, "I want you to meet my friend. This is my friend. His name is this." And she said, "We've been friends for years, but what I need to know is where's my sweetheart, because they are best friends and he didn't bring him with him." And she was quite offended that he hadn't brought him with him. But she could see him. And I wasn't going to say nobody's there. She could see him. She had a conversation with this gentleman. She laid down and she died 2 hours later.
Oh my goodness.
It was
That gives
just
me
time
chills.
to go. I had the most precious experience I had as a hospice nurse, and I've had a million of them, but the most precious experience I hadn't been a hospice nurse very long, so my dad hadn't been gone very long. And I had this wonderful patient. He was a young dad. He was maybe in his early 50s. I can't exactly remember his age, but he had several children and he was dying of cancer. He had a horrible tumor and he was going to leave us. And one day I walked down the hall and I sat down right by him, and his eyes followed into the room someone and stopped at the end of his bed. And so the hair on the back of my neck just stood up. I thought, oh my goodness. But he was watching this person, and then he nodded and he turned to me and I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm doing really well, but can't you introduce me to this gentleman?" And I said, "Woody, I walked in here by myself." And he looked at the end of his bed and he looked at me. He looked at the end of his bed and he said, "Sweetheart, your dad walks with you when you work and he's very proud."
Oh, no.
And he'd never seen a picture of my dad. He'd never met my dad. He knew. And my dad was in that room.
Wow.
And I knew it. And he died just days after that, but I knew it. My dad was with me. So, as the oldest child in a family, and I had two brothers, and I'm the oldest child, and I always felt like I was probably a real big disappointment because they wanted boys and had these big strapping boys and me, But it was really precious to me to know that my dad walked with me. And there's no way, I just said, "Can you see him?" And he said, "Yes, he's right there. He's so proud of you." I wanted to say, "What does he look like? Can I talk to him?" But I didn't.
Can you tell him something for me?
What a confirming, that's just one of those life and career confirming things that I'm sure a lot of people would pray for in their whole lives, to just know that they're doing the right thing. And what an amazing feeling to know.
It was precious. Okay. I will never forget that. We need
Kleenex. To make sure Kleenex.
Anyway, so to me, To me, hospice is the most sacred thing. Allowing someone to die. You know, I have people say to me all the time, well, I'm going to start chemo or radiation, and I just can't believe it. But, you know, that's them. That's up to them. That's not up to me. That's up to them. But I don't want to see them go through something that's going to cause their death to be tragic. You know, like my dad got killed in an accident. His tractor rolled over on him and crushed him. And I mean, he was a great guy. He was great. He was hilarious. He was such a good person. And, but I remember sitting in the hospital with my mom and my two brothers and, you know, our kids and stuff, and watching him die with all the bells and whistles and all the tubes and all the needles and all the medication. And I watched that brain scan. It was flat. He wasn't coming back. And we watched him go through so much when we could have just, you know, I wanted so badly, you know, in hindsight, I wish we would have just taken him home and let him die in his bed, you know, because he was going to anyway. But we went through all that. They were going to do surgery on his hip and, you know, and all this stuff that wasn't going to save his life.
So in other words, just because we can doesn't mean we should. I mean, because that's
exactly right.
Because we're sort of in this stage of the world, right? And I've noticed this with some people that have experienced death, is that we just have a really, really hard time accepting death, because somebody should be able to do something to fix this. And surely there's a medicine, there's a drug, there's a doctor, there's a specialist, there's a clinic somewhere that has an answer to whatever ails, you know, my mom or my dad, or, and we're fighting. And I have some questions, I think, especially in regard to this year. This has been quite a year with COVID, right? And here we're doing all these interesting things to try to save grandma and grandpa.
Yes, we have.
Right? And preserve life. And I'm just curious now, because you work at a facility, and I'm curious because part of life, well, here we talked about part of life is death. I mean, it's something we're all 100%. What do we say? The two events in life is death and taxes, right? But yet we fight so much, because when I look back at my ancestors, like the pioneers across the plains, I mean, they had these huge families because they were hoping maybe 30, 40% of them would live to adulthood. Right. I mean, they were burying their children on, when you look at these records of, you know, 12 births and only
2 lived.
4 or 5 lived to adulthood. This was life and death were death was part of everyday life, I guess is what I was trying to say. But now with all these technological advances and everything else, I think we've come to this point now where we just can't accept sickness, pain, heartache, and especially death. So what's your comment? I'm curious how this has affected working in a senior care facility. How has this affected? Because I've lost sleep over thinking about the loneliness. I think in good days, it's lonely. It's so lonely. But then being told that they can't see family and whatnot. I'd be curious what your thoughts are there.
It's been a real struggle we shut down our building on March 13th, and I mean, shut it down. So the only people who were allowed to come in were like hospice or home health. And there were many facilities who even shut them down to that, shut theirs away from those people.
They didn't even get to die with hospice?
They would pick one company that they, you know, were the most affiliated with in many cases. And they would just shut all the other companies out. We continued to allow people to come in, those people, but families didn't get to come in. And, you know, that was, our company is owned by a big company in another state, and they, you know, that state was having real problems with COVID. I mean, serious, you know, huge numbers of people dying. And we've tried really hard to make exceptions, but we've had to have doctor's orders in order to have family come in. If someone was on hospice and they began to die, we would just let the family come in. And that was really tough because they'd have to gown and mask and glove and, not touch and not hug. And,
not even the person who's dying?
No, they weren't supposed to touch them. But a lot of times, in my opinion, it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission. So, I couldn't not hug my mother. I couldn't. Yeah. I couldn't not hug my dad. I couldn't.
Well, and I know you said the company was out of state, so they kind of just, broadly.
They're in California,
rules,
so California was a big deal.
But did you see a lot of issues with? Did a lot of people die in the home?
Yeah, they did.
And
did a lot
of people die from COVID? No, not from COVID.
Well, that's what I was going to ask is how did this lockdown affect the people in your facility? How did this affect their attitude and their level of happiness? Because that's life. If we're going to talk about death, but let's talk about life and living.
We lost a lot of them because of loneliness. That's just the bottom line. We lost people because of loneliness, and you can always say, well, no, they were on hospice, so. But I've been in their rooms. I've gone in and sat with them. We tried so hard as administrative staff to make sure that we would go into the rooms of people, and just spend some time with them. But there are people that live in my building that have dementia. And I had a precious situation with a little man whose daughter actually was so sad that she couldn't come in, and he was getting more and more and more forgetful. And one day, right around Christmas, it might have been a couple days after Christmas, I went up to his room and he said, well, I guess you've heard about my sweetheart. And I said, no, I haven't heard. And she'd passed away years ago. He said, well, she wants a divorce. And I said, are you sure? And he said, I'm sure. I've tried to call her. She doesn't answer. I don't know what to do. So I went into his bedroom and got a picture of his sweetheart off of his bed. Off of his dresser. It was a picture of her on her deathbed. And I took it into him and I said, okay, I'm going to talk to you really straight. And sometimes that's really hard. And he says, oh no, I want you to tell me. So I showed him the picture and I said, who is this? And he said her name. And I said, where is she? And he said, well, she's in bed because she got very sick. And I said, did she get better? And he just looked at me and he said, well, she must have, because now she wants a divorce. And I said, she didn't get better. She passed away and she's in heaven and she's okay. And she's just waiting for you. And he burst into tears and cried. 45 minutes I sat in his room and he cried like a little baby. He laid his head on my shoulder. He thanked me. We put a puzzle together and he kept crying and then he'd thank me. And it's so interesting because this little man can't remember. And he doesn't know that he lives where I work. He thinks he works where I work. Oh, he's the maintenance man, and we have a wonderful maintenance man and he takes him and has him vacuum rooms of people that have, left or has him clean windows and stuff. And he's just thrilled. But so it's been 3 months. He still will say, you saved me. And I said, how did I save you? And he said, because I thought she wanted a divorce and you reminded me that she was already gone. And, wow. He forgets everything, but he doesn't forget that conversation. Wow. And we kept the picture out. It's sitting at his side in a chair in his recliner. But we have people who are retired doctors or retired nurses or retired military. And I go into one of the gentleman's rooms every once in a while and talk to him. And every time I walk into his room, he's staring out the window. And I always say, what you doing? And he's like, just thinking about how great it will be when we don't have to sit and stare out the window. Wow. But then there are a lot of them are saying, thank you for keeping us safe. And I think, are we keeping you safe?
Right.
What are we doing? And I know that that's this is a fine line. Yes, we've kept him really safe, but we've also kept him really alone.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I was just thinking of generally as our parents age, and I know I sometimes I see, and I've also worked in the public sphere as well, and sometimes you see people just not having nearly enough patience and respect for their older relatives. And I guess I'd be curious what your advice is for family members, and just some words of wisdom and some sage advice working with the elderly is like, how do we extend, how do we truly, have that patience and that love and cope with some of the, because, the memory lapses and some of there's a lot of things. And sometimes there's even some anger and frustration. Their personalities change as they really do, as they deteriorate. And I'm just curious what you would tell families that are dealing with relatives and what your advice is there.
Yeah. And not only that, but also like how it, from your perspective, maybe how it benefits us to continue associating and continue to be there for them,
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that we were able to do, and I'm so grateful that we were able to do it, but we got a big iPad, and it's big. And we started having visits from family on like a FaceTime or a Zoom. And, a lot of these people had never heard of such a thing. It's like, what are we doing?
Me up, Scotty.
How can I see my daughter,
Right.
And it was really, those are really precious. But I can tell you the number one thing, and it's a rule that I will never go away from. And I have my mom's getting older, my husband's mom's getting older. And I always have to remember, you do not ever correct, you redirect. And I hear some of the cruelest things from families. It's like, I can't believe you are asking me that again, or, how many times do I have to tell you? And I'm like, oh my gosh, but I listen to parents do that to little kids. I've told you this. How many times do I have to tell you this? And now they're saying it to their aged parent. Life is a huge circle. Mm-hmm. I wrote a poem several years ago. I actually had a patient that was beginning the dying process, and he had one child. And I called his son and I said, he's going to go. And I said, I'll meet you over there. And he said, okay. And when I got there, they had cleaned the room completely out. They'd removed his clothes, all of his pictures, everything was gone. And he met me at the door and he said, when he dies, call me and let me know. And he left. And so I sat there for about 4 hours and I could hear in the background it was American Idol was in the background. I could hear the cars on the freeway and I was listening to him breathe. And, his breath was, it was, end of life breathing. And I knew it wasn't going to be long, but I had these feelings about him and this picture of his life. And how sad, we've got, we get a baby and it's so great to have a new baby. I just have a brand new grandson and brand new great grandson. And we get these babies and here they are. And oh my gosh, we're so happy. And it was hard to get them here. It was really hard to get them here. It wasn't fun to spend 9 months, in that situation. And then if you don't have a C-section, it's hard to get them here. But, so we labor, and they are so dependent on us for so many years, and then they become independent. And then there's a circle. Mm-hmm. And guess what? You get to come back to dependence and complete complete dependence, not independence. Complete dependence on other people. And so I think sometimes, if a parent was impatient with their child or whatever, the child grows up to be very impatient with the parent. Yes. And that is not always the thing. Absolutely not always. But so not ever correcting, just redirecting. You can redirect somebody easily. There are situations where people have Lewy body dementia or things like that. And they do become really mean, and that's really hard. And I've had sweet little wives and sweet husbands taking care of somebody who was just raging, and you don't even know this person anymore.
Yeah.
But I've seen some really precious things, and I've seen some really awful things, but I just think you just have to realize that they are still their Heavenly Father's child, and we have no right to find fault with that person and to, and I don't know. It's just one of those things. I think the respect, this to me, the generation now that live in facilities are the greatest generation that's ever lived. They love God. They love this country. They love freedom. They're very patriotic. I wish we didn't have to let all these people go because they're really precious. We have a wall at the facility where I work, and it's a big wall of people that have been in the military. It's a whole wall, and it's pictures of these wonderful people who have fought for our country and fought for our freedom. Well, it's incredible.
There's a meme out there that I love, and it shows an elderly gentleman looking into the mirror, and he sees his young serviceman, and it says, before you diss your grandpa, know that he was well, I won't use the word they use, but way cooler than you ever.
Yeah, than you ever will be.
And that's true. I mean, I guess seeing them for trying to remember that what these people have done in their lifetime, and all of a sudden they're in this stage of dependency, which I can't imagine how hard that is on their dignity and on, to be someone that had provided so much and fought for this country and done so many amazing things, and now to be completely dependent on someone
and locked in a facility.
And I'm sure that as their children and grandchildren are living such busy lives, that can feel like a burden to have to go make that obligatory visit to grandma or grandpa or whatever.
So many.
And I wish that we could understand. I wish there was ways we could utilize their wisdom and their knowledge and their just vast experience.
I do too. I think
connect with our younger generation somehow.
I think that's super important for for Christmas. I don't want to say that we're old. My husband's younger than me, but we're not that old. But our kids got us this thing where every week they send you a thing about your life, and you have to answer these questions. And my husband's is like, "Oh, yes." And I'm like, "No, you can't say yes." But did you ever have a job before you were in high school? Yes. I'm like, no. But I think part of the really important part is just to be able to remember who they are, not the parent that was mean to you or grounded you or, went through a hard time in their life, and maybe they didn't pay as much attention to you as a child as you felt that they should. That should never matter. We should never. The biggest problem with trying to die peacefully is trying to die or allowing someone to die without regret. Regret is the worst thing in the world to live with, because I've watched people come to the bedside of somebody who is dragging out their last breath and say, "Please don't die. I've got to tell you something. I've got to explain to you some things." It's like, you can't. So don't live your life with regret. I mean, there are times that my dad, like I said, was killed in an accident. And so my mom and I have had some trouble sometimes getting along, and it's like, I have to look at her with heavenly eyes instead of, I just hate that she did this, it's like, well, she hates that I did that, there are things so I just feel like we need to be able to communicate with the people, like the people in my building, a phone call every day. I don't care who, I don't care how busy you are or what, a phone call, a card, flowers. I mean, we do have some residents that are absolutely cherished by their families, and the piles of gifts and the letters and the cards and the flowers and, the calls, and it's just amazing. And then we have other people whose kids are very busy, and they'll make lots of excuses for their very busy children.
Wow.
Well, I've worked at the airport before. Yeah. And we've had several, what we call them, drop and runs.
Oh yeah.
Where like, Mike, here's my 85-year-old dad, and he's deaf and he's partially blind, and I need a wheelchair service, and my car's running out there. I got to get going.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
And I've had to say, and you're going to go with them to the gate, right? And I'm nodding my head, trying to help them understand, right? Oh, no, the car's running. I got to go. Literally dumping their parent in an international airport with
Gosh.
trusting them to complete strangers.
Right.
Sometimes some that don't speak English even that well. You know what I mean?
Right.
And you have deaf and blind, and you're just dumping them and hoping that they'll get to where they're going. Okay. Like you're sending them to the next relative.
Yeah.
I've seen this happen more often than I would like to
I'm
admit.
sure you have.
And
I've seen
it's
things
tough.
like that too. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen hospice patients that live by themselves and they have children that, come to visit, but, and maybe that person doesn't want to move in with them because they do not want to be a burden. Number one, they do not want to be a burden. So we have a couple of sweet, darling women that live at my building that put themselves there, because they did not want to be a burden. But we have a couple people right now who are going home because their children are just saying, we have got to be able to see them. Wow. We can't do this anymore, even though, this is almost at the end of this, but, I hope it's at the end of it. But anyway, I just feel like it's not cheap to put somebody in an assisted living.
That's the truth.
It is so expensive. So does that become a burden? So are they upset that they're spending all of their inheritance to take care of somebody who isn't leaving fast enough? But then when it is time for them to pass, they don't want them to go because there's a lot of regret.
Wow.
So,
and I love how you talked earlier about, I don't know, I just feel like that kind of picture of the circle of life where it's like they raised you when you were so dependent. And there's some people's parents who don't really get to that point. They may pass away before they're
my dad
become dependent upon you.
Yeah, my dad was completely independent.
But I just really hope people listening to this can kind of take some of that into their heart, because I feel like you were saying, like there is so much knowledge and so much experience and so much faithfulness that comes from these elderly people that lived through such an incredible time in history. And I hope that everyone listening can kind of just take some of that and recognize that it benefits us.
Yeah.
Just as it benefits them, for us to help them in their, their last days.
Right.
And even before that, there's probably, decades before that happens where you should still be participating in their life like they participated in yours.
Mm-hmm.
I just, if I can take just 1 second, I'm going to read you that little poem that I wrote just because I want you to know what, sitting at this person's bedside and knowing that his son could, people grieve in different ways. So his son probably could not be there and watch his dad die.
Yeah.
I hope that's the excuse I'm giving him. But anyway, I just said, the labored breath escapes his body. I watch him and I wait, mostly due to force of habit, for the next shallow breath. I wait and I find myself reflecting on what this sweet man's life must have been like. At one time, he was vibrant, young, and ready to take on the world. He threw rocks, picked up bugs, put a worm on a hook, rode a bike, marveled at how amazing it was that God could make a fuzzy caterpillar into a beautiful butterfly. He received an education, played basketball, caught a pass, hit one out, teased the girls, goofed off with his friends, and fell in love. He married his sweetheart, marveled at the birth of his son, began a career, went to church, and honored God. He got up most mornings bright and early, showered and shaved his handsome face, got dressed the same way every day, and went off to support those who loved and trusted him. Perhaps he liked to sing. Perhaps he could really move on the dance floor. Perhaps he secretly loved Valentine's Day and birthdays. Perhaps he cried when he lost a pet, a friend, his parents, and the love of his life. He got old. It was hard to walk unassisted. It was hard to eat unassisted. It was hard to live unassisted. What an amazing and interesting circle life is. I wait, and the only sounds I hear are the ticking of a clock on the stark white wall above his head. Young, vibrant people competing in a contest on TV in the next room. Traffic rushing somewhere on the freeway outside the window. Not a sound from the man lying in the bed next to me. Except to an honored few, his life has gone relatively unnoticed by the world as well as his passing. Quietly, unassuming, and disturbing no one, he slipped into his new world. I sit alone, but surrounded by angels, and feel so grateful to have been invited to his homecoming. Sorry, I wrote it and I can't read it without crying. But I felt like it was a homecoming. I felt like, there's been times in my life as a hospice nurse when I would pass the Ashford or the Charleston or Bel Air or all these places, and I truly could feel. And I truly felt the sense that there were sentinels standing outside those buildings. And I know that's also applicable to homes, but those buildings house the people that were the greatest generation on this earth. And I will never not think that, no matter what they did or no matter who tries to cancel that out. They are the greatest generation. And I believe that they are guarded, and I believe that they are guided, and I believe that they are protected. I just feel like COVID has been, it's killed so much, and not people. It's just killed so much. Yeah. So it's hard for me to, there's days I walk out of work and I look out my window and they're looking at me leave, and it breaks my heart because I get to go home. I get to go to a restaurant. And they've had dinner in their rooms for 9 months, and not been able to eat in the dining room, stuff like that. So,
well, and even associate with each other as much, probably.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, no, they can't.
We don't realize just how isolated a lot of our elderly have been this last year.
You have no idea. And we, as staff, we tried and we worked hard to make sure that we visited everyone every day for minutes, but we're not their family. We don't know their lives. We know what they are here, and we know who they are here, but we don't know the love that they shared with someone or the experiences they had. We don't know. So it's been a really tough year.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Sean. These are sacred experiences. I have really felt just how precious these are for you, and what a blessing that you have been able to be there for so many of these homecomings, I guess.
It's been such a blessing
and
to watch people leave.
Yeah, it's just really given me a different perspective about that, just that dignity of life and the sanctity of life. Yeah. And also that divinely appointed. That's the word. That divinely appointed time,
Right.
Well, thank you so much. And I know that hopefully all of you listening have kind of felt some of what we felt today, some of the sacredness and sanctity of life, of all the way from conception to death. And I think it's just an amazing thing. So thank you so much for taking some time.
You're very welcome.
We're just grateful to have you on.
Sure.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Raising Family Podcast. This episode was produced by Carol Rice. Our research coordinator is Angela Valentine. Audio was edited and mixed by John Wright. The Raising Family Podcast is brought to you by thefamilyproclamation.org.